When darkness threatens to swallow an innocent life, a mighty and unexpected being rises to defy fate. But what happens when even the waters turn against you? The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains that embraced Sweet Valley, painting the sky with shades of orange and red. Richard Anderson gazed out the panoramic window of his office, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and his mind filled with dark thoughts. From the top floor of the only corporate building in the small town, he could see the Sweet River winding like a vital artery through the valley. "Mr. Anderson, the documents for you to sign." Martha's voice, his secretary, brought him back to reality. On the desk, a pile of papers confirmed what he already knew. Anderson Enterprises was sinking. "Thank you, Martha. You can go home." When he was alone, Richard let out a deep sigh. 10 years building an empire, and in just 6 months everything was crumbling. Debts were accumulating, investors were fleeing like rats from a sinking ship, and creditors pursued him with incessant calls. The businessman picked up the picture frame on his desk. Sophie, his 5-year-old daughter, smiled innocently in the photograph, sitting in her wheelchair. Those big brown eyes that were once his greatest joy now seemed to accuse him. "How will I tell you that your father is a failure?" he muttered, placing the picture frame face down. His cell phone rang again. It was Marcus Graham, his main creditor. "Anderson, I'm losing patience. Either you present a solution by the end of the week, or I take drastic measures." "I need more time, Marcus. I have some interested investors." "Lies," the voice on the other end exploded. "Nobody wants to associate with you. News about your financial manipulations is starting to circulate." A chill ran down Richard's spine. If the truth about how he had manipulated the company's numbers came to light, it wouldn't just be his company that would lose, but his reputation, his freedom. "I have a daughter to take care of, Marcus." "You should have thought about her before." "Diverting money from investors." The call ended, leaving Richard in a suffocating silence. He got in his car and drove home, his head throbbing with the weight of the wrong decisions he had made. Upon arriving at his mansion on the outskirts of Sweet Valley, he found Lucy, Sophie's nanny, in the living room. "How is she?" he asked mechanically. "Good. She spent the day drawing and asking about you," Lucy replied with a tone of veiled disapproval. "She's in her room now." Richard climbed the stairs, each step seeming heavier than the last. Opening the door to the room decorated in shades of pink and lilac, he found Sophie in her wheelchair scribbling in a notebook. "Daddy!" exclaimed the girl, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Hi, Princess," he forced a smile, approaching. "I made a drawing for you." Sophie extended the paper where she had drawn what appeared to be the two of them under a smiling sun. At the bottom of the drawing, a blue line represented Sweet River. "It's you, me, and the river where you promised to take me for a boat ride." Richard felt a lump in his throat. He had made that promise months ago before everything began to fall apart. "It's beautiful, Sophie, and don't worry, I'll take you for a ride on the river, tomorrow itself." The girl's eyes lit up. "Really, Daddy? Do you promise?" As he stroked his daughter's hair, a terrible idea began to form in Richard's mind. Sweet River, with its deep waters and strong current due to the recent rains, an accident would be so easy to fake. "I promise, Princess," he replied, feeling a tightness in his chest. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He tossed in bed, his mind oscillating between financial desperation and the abominable idea that had emerged. Sophie was a responsibility he could no longer bear. Caring for a child with special needs required money, time, dedication, all of which he no longer had. Through the bedroom window, he could see the river in the distance, its waters reflecting, the moonlight like a sinister invitation. If Sophie disappeared, he could start over from scratch, sell the house, liquidate what remained of the company, perhaps even get insurance. The thought disgusted him, but didn't leave him. In the darkness of the room, fighting against his own conscience, Richard made a decision that would forever change the fate of Sweet Valley. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. Dawn came to Sweet Valley with a sky heavy with grey clouds. Richard awoke after a night of disturbing dreams, where he saw himself sinking in the dark waters of Sweet River, dragged by the relentless current. His body was exhausted, but his mind worked at full speed, calculating every detail of the plan he had devised during the night. Beside his bed, on the nightstand, his cell phone vibrated. It was Frank, his accountant, sending an urgent message. Received a summons from the IRS. They're investigating the company's accounts. We need to talk. Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. The circle was closing in. If the authorities discovered the financial maneuvers he had made to keep the company running, his reputation would be definitively ruined. Mr. Richard? Lucy's voice echoed from the hallway. Sophie is already awake and asking about the boat trip. The mention of the trip made his stomach turn. For a moment, he thought about giving up, about finding another solution. But which one? The debts were accumulating, the creditors were becoming more aggressive, and the investigation into his finances was beginning to take shape. Tell her I'm getting ready. We'll leave in an hour, he replied, swallowing hard. In the shower, he let the water run down his body as if it could wash away his dark thoughts. He closed his eyes and saw Sophie, his daughter, the girl who once represented everything good in his life. When she was born, Richard was at the peak of success, and the news that his daughter would have a condition that would keep her in a wheelchair for life didn't shake him. He had money, he had resources to give her everything she needed. But now Sophie was a burden that grew heavier each day. The treatments, the adaptations to the house, the constant care, all of this cost a fortune he no longer had. Leaving his room, he found Sophie already dressed, sitting in her wheelchair in the hallway, a broad smile illuminating her face. "Good morning, Daddy. I'm ready for the trip." She wore a light blue dress that matched. Her eyes and her brown hair was tied in a braid carefully done by Lucy. In her lap was a small teddy bear, her inseparable companion since she received it from her mother, before Anna departed forever, a victim of an illness that rapidly consumed her when Sophie was only 2 years old. "You look beautiful, Princess," he managed to say, forcing a smile. "Mr. Richard, I prepared a snack for you to take," said Lucy, extending a cooler bag. "And don't forget that Sophie needs to take her medicine at 10 o'clock. Richard nodded mechanically, observing Lucy with renewed attention. The nanny had been hired shortly after Anna's death and knew all the details of Sophie's routine. For a moment, he imagined what she would say when he returned alone from the trip, but pushed the thought away. There would be no questions. It would be a tragic accident, nothing more. "Let's go, Sophie, the river awaits us." He put his daughter in the car, folded the wheelchair, and stored it in the trunk. Before leaving, he cast a final glance at the mansion that would soon no longer be his. Perhaps after everything, he could sell the property and start anew in another city, without the weight of Sophie, without the burden of debts, without the shadow of failure. The path to the river was silent, with Richard immersed in thoughts and Sophie humming softly, oblivious to the turmoil in her father's mind. The road wound through the hills surrounding Sweet Valley, offering glimpses of Sweet River below, its muddy waters flowing strongly due to the recent rains. "Daddy, look at the size of the river," exclaimed Sophie when the car began to descend toward the valley. "It's much bigger than in my drawing." "Yes, it's full because of the rains," Richard replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to be careful." Upon reaching the small wooden dock that served as a starting point for fishermen and occasional tourists, Richard noted with relief that the place was deserted. It was a Wednesday morning, and most of Sweet Valley's residents were working. Besides, the cloudy weather didn't invite outings. "Are we going to be alone here, Daddy?" asked Sophie, a shadow of apprehension crossing her gaze. "Don't worry, Princess, I know this river well," he lied, trying to reassure her. The truth was that Richard rarely visited Sweet River. His days were consumed by work, and when he had free time, he preferred the luxurious restaurants of the nearest city to the bucolic scenery of Sweet Valley. But that didn't matter now. All he needed was a boat, the strong current, and the absence of witnesses. At the edge of the dock, a small boat was moored. It belonged to Paul, an old fisherman who used to rent the vessel to tourists. Richard had called him the day before, inventing a story about wanting to surprise his daughter with a boat ride. "Ready for adventure, Sophie?" he asked, removing the wheelchair from the trunk. The girl's smile was his answer. As he placed her in the chair, Richard felt a tightness in his chest. For a brief moment, he reviewed their entire history. Sophie's birth, her first smiles, the sleepless nights when she fell ill, the joy when she said "Daddy" for the first time. But then his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. It was Marcus Graham. Again, "Your deadline ends today, Anderson. Don't test me." The message was like a cold shower, bringing him back to the harsh reality. There was no choice. It was Sophie or him, and Richard Anderson wasn't ready to lose everything he had built. The wooden dock creaked under the weight of the wheelchair as Richard pushed it slowly toward the boat. The sky was increasingly heavy, with dark clouds promising an imminent storm. The wind was beginning to blow harder, stirring the waters of Sweet River. "Daddy, it's windy," said Sophie, clinging to her teddy bear more tightly. "Are you sure we can go boating today?" Richard hesitated for a moment. Something in his daughter's voice, in the innocence of those trusting eyes, made a remnant of his conscience emerge. But soon, the image of the creditors, the accumulated debts, the crumbling empire, erased any hesitation. "It'll just be a quick ride, Princess. I promise." With calculated care, he transferred Sophie from the wheelchair to the boat. The vessel rocked dangerously with the movement, causing the girl to cling to the edges. "It's very unstable, Daddy," she exclaimed, fear evident in her voice. "It's normal, Sophie. We'll get used to it soon." Richard untied the boat and with a push of the oar moved away from the dock. The current soon captured them, dragging them downstream. Sophie, initially frightened, began to relax as she saw the contours of Sweet Valley from a new perspective. The colorful houses along the river, the mountains in the background, the trees swaying with the wind. Everything seemed magical seen from the water. "Look, Daddy, that blue house is Miss Ellie's," she pointed enthusiastically. "And there on that hill is the school. Do you think my friends can see me from here?" Richard just nodded, rowing occasionally, more to maintain direction than to accelerate. The plan was simple. Take the boat to a more turbulent part of the river, where the current was strong enough to capsize the vessel. Then he would swim back to the shore, while Sophie— he couldn't complete the thought. A fog of guilt tried to infiltrate his determination, but he repelled it with the memory of the threats, the debts, the imminent ruin. "Daddy, are you okay?" Sophie's voice interrupted his dark thoughts. "You look sad." "Just tired, Princess," he replied, forcing a smile. "Too much work." "Mommy always said you worked too much," commented Sophie, her gaze lost on the riverbank. "She said that one day you would realize there are more important things than money." The words struck Richard like a physical blow. Anna, his late wife, had always criticized his obsession with success and money. Even during her illness, when the diagnosis left no hope, she had begged him to spend more time at home with her and Sophie. "You'll regret all the hours you spent in that office instead of with your family," were some of her last words. The boat continued to glide down the river, faster and faster as they approached a curve, where he knew the current was stronger. Richard could hear the sound of water hitting rocks, announcing the perfect location for his plan. "Daddy, we're going." "Too fast." Sophie clung more tightly to the edges of the boat, her eyes now wide with fear. "Calm down, Sophie. Everything will be fine," he lied, feeling his heart race. It was at that moment that he spotted something on the other bank of the river. A large, robust figure with dark fur was watching the boat attentively. Jack, the legendary buffalo of Sweet Valley, raised from a calf by Joseph, an eccentric old farmer who lived isolated in the hills. The local residents told stories about the animal, saying it possessed an almost human intelligence and a special connection with the river. Richard had never given credit to these stories, considering them local folklore, but something in the buffalo's fixed gaze deeply disturbed him. It was as if the animal could see through him, could read his intentions. "Look, Daddy, it's Jack," exclaimed Sophie, her fear momentarily forgotten at the sight of the imposing animal. "Miss Ellie told us about him at school. They say he saves people who fall into the river." A shiver ran down Richard's spine. It was as if the universe was conspiring against his plan, placing obstacles, giving him chances to reconsider. But it was too late to turn back. They were almost at the river bend where the waters became more agitated. "Sophie, hold on tight," he instructed, preparing for what would come next. The boat entered the turbulent area, rocking violently. Sophie screamed, frightened as the splashing waters soaked her dress. Richard, pretending to try to stabilize the vessel, was actually strategically positioning himself for what he planned to do next. A few meters away, Joseph observed the scene from his porch. At 70 years old, with a white beard reaching his chest, and a straw hat always present, the old farmer had developed a kind of sixth sense for danger, and something in that boat, in that man, told him that something was very wrong. "Jack is restless," he murmured to himself, noticing the buffalo's agitation. Something's going to happen. In the boat, Sophie was now openly crying, begging to return. "Daddy, please, I want to go home. It's too scary." Richard looked at his daughter, so small, so defenseless, so at his. A wave of nausea invaded him. What was he about to do? What kind of monster had he become? For a moment, he saw himself through Anna's eyes, through Sophie's eyes, and detested what he saw. "Calm down, Sophie. We're going back now," he said, suddenly determined to row against the current, to return to the dock to find another solution to his problems. But it was too late. A stronger wave hit the boat from the side, completely destabilizing it. "Sophie," screamed, desperately clinging on. Richard tried to reach her, but the abrupt movement only worsened the situation. In a matter of seconds, the boat capsized, throwing both of them into the turbulent waters of Sweet River. The shock of the cold water took Richard's breath away. He submerged for a moment before resurfacing, coughing and choking. His first reaction was to look for Sophie, who had disappeared beneath the turbulent waters. "Sophie! Sophie!" Richard's desperate cry echoed through the valley, overriding the roar of the waters. The current dragged him mercilessly as he struggled to keep his head above water, his eyes burning as he frantically scanned the surface for any sign of his daughter. The plan he had so coldly elaborated now seemed like distant madness, replaced by the genuine panic of a father who might lose his daughter. "Sophie!" he shouted again, swallowing water as he was pulled down by a whirlpool. When he managed to resurface, he saw a flash of blue, Sophie's dress, being carried by the current a few meters ahead. The girl was desperately flailing, her fragile arms unable to fight against the force of the river. Without her legs to help her, she was completely at the mercy of the treacherous waters. Richard swam with all the strength he could muster, ignoring the burning in his muscles, the pressure in his lungs. Every second was precious. Every meter that separated him from Sophie seemed insurmountable. On the riverbank, Joseph observed the scene with a heavy heart. Despite his advanced age, the old farmer knew he couldn't just watch. But before he could do anything, Jack, the immense buffalo, took the initiative. With a guttural sound that reverberated through the valley, the animal plunged into the waters of Sweet River. Its massive body collided with the surface, creating a wave that propagated in all directions. Joseph had never seen Jack act like this, with such determination, with such purpose. "Go, my friend," murmured the old man, knowing that the buffalo, with its strength and instinct, had a better chance of saving the girl than he himself did. Richard, who was desperately swimming toward his daughter, stopped in astonishment at seeing the immense animal diving into the turbulent waters. For a moment, he feared it was a new danger. An enraged buffalo could easily injure or even kill someone in its path. "No! Stay away from her!" he shouted, trying to swim faster, feeling completely powerless. But to his surprise, the buffalo swam with clear purpose towards Sophie. With powerful movements, Jack cut through the current as if it offered no resistance at all, quickly approaching the girl who was struggling to stay afloat. Sophie, between gasps and sobs, saw the imposing figure of the animal approaching. In any other circumstance she would have been terrified, but there was something in the buffalo's gaze, a calmness, a protective determination that made her tremulously extend her hand in its direction. "Jack," she murmured, remembering the stories her teacher told about the guardian buffalo of Sweet River. With incredible precision, Jack positioned himself beside Sophie, allowing the girl to cling to his dense fur. The animal remained stable in the water like a living island, giving the little one the support she needed to stay above the surface. Richard observed the scene, paralyzed by disbelief. The animal that many considered merely part of local folklore was indeed saving his daughter, acting with an almost supernatural intelligence. It was as if everything around slowed down, the roar of the river, the beating of his heart, even his thoughts. In that moment he saw with crystal clarity the monster he had become, the moral abyss into which he had fallen. "Sophie," he whispered, tears mixing with the river water on his face. On the shore, Joseph wasted no time. With the agility of someone who knew every inch of that land, he ran to a point further down the river, where the current would naturally carry Jack and the girl. He carried a sturdy rope used to tie cattle, which could now serve for a rescue. Meanwhile, the buffalo swam carefully, not directly against the current, which would be impossible even for its tremendous strength, but diagonally, gradually heading towards the shore. Sophie clung to the animal's fur, her small fingers buried in the thick hair, her eyes tightly closed as she murmured prayers interspersed with sobs. Richard swam alongside them now, having finally reached his daughter and her unlikely savior. He tried to take Sophie from the buffalo's back, but the girl refused to let go, instinctively feeling she was safer where she was. "It's okay, Sophie. Let Jack take you to the shore," conceded Richard, realizing that the animal had much more strength to combat the current than he did. That's when they spotted Joseph on the shore, waving his arms and shouting instructions they could barely hear over the noise of the water. The old man held a rope, which he threw with surprising strength for his age. The end fell a few meters from where they were. Richard, gathering his last strength, swam to the rope and grabbed it. He felt the tug when Joseph began to pull them toward the shore. Jack, as if understanding the plan, began to swim in the same direction, facilitating the old farmer's work. After what seemed like an eternity of fighting against the waters, they finally reached the shore. Richard crawled out of the river, his muscles trembling from exhaustion. Jack emerged shortly after, with Sophie still firmly clinging to his back, her eyes wide with fear and admiration. Joseph cautiously approached the buffalo, murmuring reassuring words in a low and steady tone. With gentleness, he helped Sophie down from the animal's back, taking her in his arms with paternal care. "It's all right now, little one." "You're safe," said the old man, his voice rough but kind. Sophie, trembling from cold and shock, looked at the immense buffalo that was now shaking the water from its fur. "Thank you, Jack," she whispered, extending a trembling hand that the animal sniffed delicately before stepping back a few paces. Richard remained lying on the muddy shore, his breathing labored, his body in pain. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional storm that assailed him. He looked at Sophie, at his daughter, whom he had almost sacrificed in the name of his greed and cowardice, and felt like the worst of men. "Sophie," he began, his voice broken. "What the hell were you doing with this girl in a boat with the river in this state?" interrupted Joseph, his voice laden with accusation. "Anyone with half a mind would know it's too dangerous." Richard had no answer. How could he explain what he had planned? How could he justify the unjustifiable? "It was an accident," he murmured, averting his gaze. "Accidents don't happen by chance, young man," retorted the old man, his penetrating eyes seeming to see beyond Richard's words. "Especially in Sweet River. This river has memory, you know. It knows the intentions of those who navigate it." If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. Joseph's small house, built with local wood and stone, stood like a solitary sentinel on the hill that bordered Sweet River. The interior was simple but welcoming, with rustic furniture made by the owner himself and walls decorated with old photographs and Native American artifacts that the old man collected. Sophie, now wrapped in a warm blanket, sat near the lit fireplace, her still damp hair occasionally dripping onto the wooden floor. Her small hands held a mug of hot chocolate that Joseph had prepared, and her eyes, still marked by recent fear, followed the movement of the buffalo that rested peacefully outside, visible through the window. "Has he always been like that?" asked the girl, breaking the silence that dominated the environment. "So, Intelligent? Joseph, who was arranging dried herbs in small packages on the kitchen table, smiled. Jack isn't an ordinary buffalo, little one. I found him when he was just a calf, abandoned near the river after a flood that took his mother. Since then, we've created a special bond. Richard, sitting in a distant corner, observed the scene with a distant look. His clothes were also wet, but he barely felt the physical discomfort. His mind was filled with dark thoughts, with shame, with guilt. The cell phone in his pocket, miraculously still working, vibrated incessantly with new messages from creditors, but he didn't have the courage to check them. You realize what almost happened today, don't you? Joseph's voice, suddenly close, startled Richard. The old man had approached silently, his penetrating eyes fixed on Richard's with a disturbing intensity. It was an accident, repeated Richard without conviction. The boat capsized because... Of the current. Don't take me for a fool, young man. Joseph spoke softly so Sophie wouldn't hear. I've lived in this region for more than 5 decades. I saw the way you steered that boat directly to the most dangerous part of the river. I saw. The expression on your face when you entered the water, it wasn't surprise, it was late regret. Richard felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. How could that old man, whom he barely knew, have read his intentions with such precision? You don't understand, he murmured, his eyes filling with tears he struggled to contain. I'm ruined, I've lost everything. The creditors are going to take my house, my company, if they discover the irregularities. I committed trying. To save the business, I could even be prosecuted. Joseph observed the man before him with a mixture of disgust and pity. And that would justify sacrificing your own daughter? The question hung in the air like an accusation that Richard couldn't deny. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the old man could see every dark corner of his soul. I didn't, he began, but the words died in his throat. There was no defense for what he had planned to do. Daddy, look! Sophie's enthusiastic voice interrupted the tense moment. Jack is looking at me through the window. Indeed, the immense buffalo had approached the house, its huge head now visible through the glass. Its eyes, a deep and bright brown, seemed fixed on the girl. He likes you, commented Joseph, moving away from Richard to join Sophie near the window. Jack has always had a special instinct for people. He knows who has a good heart. Richard remained in his corner, observing his daughter smile at the animal that had saved her life. Sophie, even after all she had experienced, maintained that purity, that capacity to marvel at the world that only children possess. He remembered when she was born, how holding her for the first time had been the happiest moment of his life. When had his heart hardened so much? When had money, status, public image become more important than his daughter's smile? The sound of a vehicle approaching interrupted his thoughts. An old, dusty jeep stopped in front of the house, and from it descended Lucy, Sophie's nanny, accompanied by a woman whom Richard recognized as Ellie, his daughter's teacher. Sophie? Lucy ran inside as soon as Joseph opened the door, her red and swollen eyes revealing she had been crying. Thank God you're all right. The nanny hugged the girl tightly, as if fearing she might disappear at any moment. Ellie remained at the daughter, her gaze alternating between Sophie and Richard, an expression of relief mixed with something that seemed like distrust. When you didn't come back and it started to rain, I got worried, explained Lucy, still embracing Sophie. I called Ellie because I knew she knew the river area well. We found the wheelchair abandoned at the dock, added Ellie, her accusatory tone not going unnoticed by Richard, and no sign of you. That's when we called Joseph, who told us what happened. Richard felt cornered. The people in the room seemed to form a circle around him, each with their own level of suspicion or accusation. Only Sophie remained oblivious to the growing tension, still fascinated by the buffalo watching her through the window. It was imprudent of me to take Sophie to the river with the unstable weather, he finally said, trying to sound convincing. The boat capsized, and if it weren't for Joseph and Jack, I don't know what would have happened. A miracle, that's what, said Lucy, kissing the top of Sophie's head. A true miracle. Jack has always been special, commented Ellie, approaching the window to observe the buffalo. The students love the stories about him. They say he can sense when someone is in danger. Joseph, who until then had been observing the scene in silence, spoke. More than that, Jack senses when someone has bad intentions. Sweet River and its guardians have an ancient wisdom which many of us have forgotten. The old man cast a meaningful look at Richard, who felt a chill run down his spine. For a moment, he had the impression that everyone in the room knew exactly what he had planned to do. His cell phone vibrated again in his pocket, breaking the moment of tension. Richard took it mechanically, more out of habit than real interest. The message on the screen made him pale. "We just discovered the irregularities in the accounts. You have 24 hours to present yourself and explain, or we'll take legal measures. Marcus Graham." Reality hit him with renewed force. There was no escape. Even if he had managed to... No, he couldn't even think about that now. He looked at Sophie, at his innocent daughter whom he had almost sacrificed out of cowardice, and felt a wave of shame so intense it almost brought him to his knees. "I need to make a call," he murmured, heading for the porch of the house with heavy steps. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting golden rays over the valley. Sweet River continued its relentless course below, the waters now tinged with the gold of the evening. Jack, the immense buffalo, diverted his attention from the window and fixed it on Richard, as if he could read his thoughts. On the porch of Joseph's house, Richard stared at the horizon, the cell phone weighing in his hand like lead. Marcus Graham's message reverberated in his mind, each word a hammer striking his already fragmented conscience. There was nowhere left to run, neither from his creditors nor from himself. Jack remained motionless a few meters away, his deep eyes fixed on Richard with an almost supernatural intensity. Under that gaze, Richard felt completely exposed, as if the animal could see each of his dark intentions, each wrong decision, each layer of lies he had built. "What do you want from me?" he whispered to the buffalo, feeling ridiculous for talking to an animal but unable to resist the impulse. To his surprise, Jack moved slowly, approaching until he was less than a meter away. Richard felt a mixture of fear and fascination. The animal was truly immense seen up close, with more than a ton of powerful muscles, hooves that could easily crush a man, and imposing horns that seemed even more threatening in the evening light. But there was no aggression in its posture, just a calm, almost solemn presence. Jack slightly lowered his head, as if in an invitation, and Richard, guided by an impulse he didn't fully understand, extended his trembling hand to touch the animal's forehead. The moment his fingers touched the rough fur, something extraordinary happened. A sensation of warmth spread through his arm, rising to his chest and finally reaching his mind. Images began to appear in his consciousness, flashes of memories that didn't belong to him. He saw Sweet River through Jack's eyes, felt the animal's deep connection with those waters, with that land. He witnessed moments when the buffalo had saved other people over the years, guided by some ancestral instinct that connected him to the human lives that inhabited the valley. And then he saw himself in the boat with Sophie, saw the darkness in his heart, the terrible plan. But he also saw something else, the genuine love that still existed there, buried beneath layers of greed and despair. Richard stepped back, breathless, breaking the contact. Tears now flowed freely down his face, and he made no effort to contain them. "I almost," he murmured, unable to complete the sentence. Jack remained motionless, his eyes still fixed on Richard, but now there was something different in them. Not judgment, but understanding. As if the animal knew that, as terrible as what Richard had planned to do was, there was still a chance for redemption. The cabin door opened, and Joseph came out onto the porch, his gaze alternating between the man and the buffalo. "He showed you, didn't he?" asked the old man, his voice low and reverent. How is this possible?" Richard could barely form the words, still shaken by the experience. "Jack isn't just a buffalo, as I've said. Some call it mysticism, others call it an old man's madness, but I know what I've seen over these years. This animal carries an ancient wisdom, a connection with this land and this river that few understand." Richard looked again at Jack, who was now calmly moving away, descending the hill toward the river. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, showing the message on his cell phone to Joseph. "It's all over. They're going to discover everything. They're going to take me away, and Sophie will be left alone." Joseph observed the horizon for a long moment before responding. "There is always a path, even when we think we're cornered. But first, you need to face the truth. Not just about your business, but about yourself, about who you've become." Inside the cabin, Sophie's voice could be heard, animatedly telling Lucy and Ellie about how Jack had saved her. Her voice carried that innocence, that purity that only children possess, the same innocence that Richard had almost destroyed out of selfishness. "She would be better off without me," he murmured, more to himself than to Joseph. "Is that what you really believe?" retorted the old man. "Or is it just another way to escape?" The question hit Richard like a physical blow. Throughout his life, he had used work, money, status as shields to avoid facing his true responsibilities. Even after Anna's departure, he had plunged even deeper into business, using the excuse of needing to secure Sophie's future to justify his absence in his daughter's life. "I don't know what I believe anymore," he admitted, running his hand over his tired face. "Then start with the basics," suggested Joseph. "Do you love your daughter?" "More than anything." "Then that's where you should begin." The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, tinting the sky with shades of orange and red that reflected in the waters of Sweet River. Richard remained silent, absorbing the moment, allowing the truth about his actions and his choices to finally emerge from within him. When he entered the cabin again, he found Sophie sitting on the floor, drawing on a paper Joseph had given her. Upon seeing him, the girl smiled, that innocent and trusting smile that should never have been betrayed. "Daddy, look what I'm drawing. It's Jack saving me in the river." Richard approached and knelt beside his daughter, observing the childish drawing where a large brown buffalo carried a small figure in a blue dress over the blue and agitated waters. "It's beautiful, Sophie," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "When we go back home, I want to hang it in my room so I never forget Jack," continued the girl, adding details to the drawing. The innocence of those words was like a knife to Richard's heart. When we go back home, a home that would soon no longer be theirs, when the truth about his financial manipulations came to light. "Sophie," he began, not knowing exactly what he would say, but feeling that he needed to start being honest, at least with her. "Daddy has made some mistakes, serious mistakes." The girl looked at him, her head slightly tilted, her eyes attentive. "What kind of mistakes?" "The kind that might make us have to leave our house, move somewhere else," he explained, trying to simplify a situation that was infinitely more complex. To his surprise, Sophie didn't seem alarmed. "That's okay, Daddy. We can live somewhere else as long as we stay together." The simplicity of that response, the unconditional trust that Sophie still placed in him, caused something to break inside Richard. Years of unbridled ambition, of morally questionable decisions, of emotional distance, all of this now seemed so empty, so meaningless in the face of his daughter's pure love. In an impulse, he hugged Sophie tightly, the tears finally overcoming the barrier he had erected around his emotions. The girl, although surprised by the intensity of her father's reaction, returned the hug with equal force. "I love you so much, Sophie," he whispered against his daughter's hair, "so much that I can't even explain." "I love you too, Daddy," she replied, with the simplicity of someone stating an absolute and unquestionable truth. Lucy and Ellie observed the scene with emotional expressions, while Joseph remained slightly apart, a faint smile on his wrinkled lips. Outside, the last ray of sunlight of the day briefly illuminated the imposing figure of Jack, who observed the scene through the window before moving away toward the river. Tentar novament, scontinuar editar plotted translation strategy, with Americanized names and settings. I need to continue translating the story from Portuguese to English, maintaining the Americanized names and locations while keeping the original story structure and length. I'll pick up where I left off. I've already changed Ricardo Almeida to Richard Anderson, changed Vale Doce to Sweet Valley, changed Rio Doce to Sweet River, changed Marcia to Martha, changed Sophia to Sophie, changed Marcelo, Gomes to Marcus Graham, changed Louisa to Lucy, changed Anna to Anna, changed Paulo to Paul, changed Jassy to Jack, changed Joachim to Joseph, changed Elisa to Ellie, changed Tupin to Thunder. I'll use this for the continuation. Changed Iara to Iris. I'll use this for the continuation. I need to continue the story with these name changes, maintaining the same narrative flow and emotional impact while making the setting feel authentically American. Morning came to Sweet Valley, bringing with it a crystal-clear blue sky, as if the previous day's storm had never existed. Richard opened his eyes slowly, disoriented for a moment, to find himself lying on a rustic sofa, covered by a hand-woven wool blanket. The events of the previous day returned to his mind like fragments of a nightmare. The boat, the turbulent river, Sophie in the water, Jack. He sat up abruptly, his heart racing. Sophie? Where was Sophie? She's fine. Joseph's voice came from the kitchen. The old man was preparing breakfast, the aroma of fresh bread and freshly brewed coffee filling the room. Lucy took her to wash up in the creek behind the house. Ellie went to school but promised to return later. Richard nodded, feeling momentary, relief that was quickly replaced by the crushing reality of his situation. The cell phone in his pocket was silent. The battery must have died during the night, but he knew it would be full of new threatening messages from Marcus and other creditors. "What do you plan to do now?" asked Joseph, placing a steaming mug of coffee on the table in front of Richard. The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. What could he do? Run? Continue lying? The options seemed increasingly limited, each path leading to more pain, more destruction. "I don't know," he finally admitted, getting up to take the coffee. "Maybe it's time to face the consequences." Joseph observed him for a moment, his wrinkled eyes full of a wisdom that only years can provide. "You know, when I found Jack, he was so frightened, so distrustful. He had been abandoned, injured, betrayed by the very nature that took his mother. I thought he would never trust humans." Richard sipped the coffee, waiting for Joseph to get to the point of his story, which was obviously a parable for his own situation. "And what happened?" he finally asked when the silence extended. "Time, consistency, honesty," replied the old man. "I didn't try to force him to trust me. I just was present day after day, showing that I was there to help. Eventually he understood that he didn't need to be afraid, that he didn't need to attack first to protect himself." Richard considered the words for a moment. "Are you saying I should earn the trust of my creditors?" Joseph laughed, a harsh but warm sound. "I'm saying you need to stop running from yourself, from the truth, from the consequences. It's the only path to redemption." The front door opened and Sophie entered, followed by Lucy. The girl seemed rejuvenated, her hair still damp from bathing, her cheeks flushed from the fresh morning air. "Daddy!" she exclaimed upon seeing Richard, her face lighting up with a smile. "Come see, Jack is outside and brought friends." Curious, Richard followed, his daughter to the porch. To his surprise, not only Jack, but a small herd of buffalo was peacefully grazing in the field that extended to the riverbank. Among them, a buffalo calf ran and jumped as if playing. "That must be Thunder," explained Joseph, who had joined them. "Born last spring, Jack's first calf." Sophie watched the animals with bright eyes, completely enchanted. "They're a family, aren't they, Mr. Joseph? Like me and Daddy." The innocence of the comparison made Richard feel a pang in his chest. What kind of father had he been? What example had he set? As he observed the interaction between Jack and the calf, he saw something he didn't expect. Protection, guidance, care. The large buffalo guided the smaller one, showing it where the grass was more succulent, gently moving it away from areas closer to the river, where the bank was steep and dangerous. A real father, a protector, not someone who sees their own child as a burden, as an obstacle to be removed. "Sophie," he said suddenly, making a decision, "we need to go home." The girl's face fell in disappointment. "But I wanted to stay a little longer with Jack." "It's not goodbye," intervened Joseph. "You can come back to visit whenever you want. Jack isn't going anywhere." Richard nodded, grateful for the intervention. Mr. Joseph is right, we'll come back, but now Daddy needs to resolve some important things, very important things. Something in his tone must have communicated the gravity of the situation, because Sophie didn't protest further. They said goodbye to Joseph, who promised to take care of Jack and convey Sophie's thanks. Lucy helped put the girl in the car, and in a few minutes they were on the road, returning to Sweet Valley. During the journey, Richard remained silent, his mind working feverishly. When they arrived at the mansion, his first act was to connect his cell phone to the charger. As expected, there were dozens of messages and missed calls. The most recent was from Marcus Graham just half an hour ago. "Last chance, Anderson. Meet me at the office by noon or the consequences will be irreversible." He looked at the clock, 10:30. He had little time. "Lucy, can you stay with Sophie? I have an important meeting." The nanny nodded, although her eyes revealed concern. "Are you all right, sir? You seem different." Richard looked at Sophie, who was beginning to animatedly tell her teddy bear about the adventure they had with Jack. "I'm starting to be," he replied honestly. "Or at least I hope I'm on the right path." He changed clothes quickly, opting for a simple suit, without the gold cufflinks or luxury watch he would normally wear. These status symbols now seemed empty, irrelevant. Before leaving, he knelt beside Sophie. "Daddy's going to solve some problems, Princess. Things might change a bit around here when I come back." Sophie looked at him with those big brown eyes, so similar to Anna's. "What kind of changes, Daddy?" Richard hesitated, unsure about how much he should reveal. "We might have to move to a smaller house, I might have to change jobs. But I promise that no matter what happens, we'll stay together, and I'll be a better father to you." To his surprise, Sophie smiled. "That's okay, I don't need a big house, I just need you, Daddy." The simplicity of that response, that unconditional trust, was like a balm for Richard's tormented heart. He kissed his daughter's forehead and left, head held high, determined to face whatever lay ahead. The office of Anderson Enterprises, once a monument to his success, now seemed like an empty shell. The receptionist's eyes widened when she saw him enter, probably surprised by his haggard appearance and the absence of his usual arrogance. "Mr. Graham is waiting in the meeting room," she informed, her voice betraying nervousness, "with other people." Richard nodded, heading to the elevator without hesitation. Entering the meeting room, he found not only Marcus Graham but also two lawyers and a man he recognized as the local police chief. "Anderson!" Marcus stood up, his face a mask of contained fury. "I thought we would need to go after you." Richard took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of calm. The last 24 hours had changed something fundamental inside him. The man who had almost sacrificed his own daughter out of cowardice no longer existed. 6 months had passed since that fateful day on Sweet River. Sweet Valley was flourishing under the spring sun, the trees laden with colorful flowers, the air perfumed by the promise of new beginnings. A small wooden house by the riverbank, modest but welcoming, had become the new home of Richard and Sophie Anderson. In the yard, a carefully constructed ramp allowed Sophie to move her wheelchair easily to the porch, from where she could observe the river that had so changed their lives. "Daddy, they're here!" Sophie's enthusiastic voice echoed through the house as she spotted a jeep approaching via the dirt road. Richard came out of the kitchen, drying his hands on a dish towel. His face, once marked by lines of worry and ambition, now displayed a serenity he had never possessed in his days as a successful businessman. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt, so different from the expensive suits that once defined his identity. "Right on time for lunch, as they promised," he commented, smiling as he saw Ellie get out of the jeep, followed by Joseph. The old farmer, leaning on a carved wooden cane, seemed more fragile than 6 months ago, but his eyes still shone with the same wisdom and vivacity. Ellie, on the other hand, seemed radiant. She had been promoted to principal of Sweet Valley School, and to Sophie's delight, had become a frequent visitor to the Andersons' new home. "We brought a surprise," announced Ellie, pointing behind the jeep, where an animal transport trailer was parked. Sophie's eyes widened with excitement. "Is it Jack? Did you bring Jack?" As a response, a deep, powerful moo came from the trailer. Joseph, laughing at the girl's reaction, opened the trailer's back door. With majestic steps, Jack emerged, his presence as imposing as Sophie remembered. And to the girl's surprise and delight, right behind him came Thunder, the calf, no longer. So small, followed by a smaller, more delicate buffalo. "And this is Iris," Joseph introduced, "the companion Jack chose last spring." "A family!" exclaimed Sophie, her face illuminated with joy. "They're a family like us," Richard observed, the scene with a tranquil smile, thinking about how life had changed drastically since that day on the river. The confession he had made to Marcus Graham and the authorities about the financial manipulations in his company had resulted, as expected, in severe consequences. Anderson Enterprises went bankrupt. The mansion and all luxury assets were sold to pay part of the debts, and he had faced a legal process that could have led to even worse consequences. But surprisingly, his honesty in taking responsibility, his total cooperation with the investigations, and, perhaps more importantly, the unexpected intervention of Ellie and Joseph as character witnesses had convinced the judge to be lenient. Instead of more severe punishments, Richard received a suspended sentence with an obligation of community service and financial restitution to those harmed. The greatest punishment, ironically, had been losing everything he once considered important: status, wealth, power. But in the months that followed, he discovered that these losses brought unexpected gains. For the first time in years, he was truly present in Sophie's life. He discovered talents he never knew he possessed, like carpentry, which he now practiced, in a small workshop at the back of the house, producing rustic furniture that was beginning to gain fame in the region. "Shall we have lunch?" invited Richard, addressing the visitors. "I made that vegetable soup you like so much, Joseph." I can hardly wait," replied the old man, inhaling the aroma coming from the kitchen. Who would have thought that the powerful Richard Anderson would become such a skilled cook? They laughed together, the joke without any trace of resentment. Joseph had become a kind of mentor for Richard, helping him rebuild not just his life, but his character, his worldview. As they headed inside, Sophie called out, "Daddy, can I stay out here a little longer with Jack and his family?" "Of course. Princess, we'll be on the porch keeping an eye on you." The girl smiled, turning her wheelchair to approach the buffalo that peacefully grazed in the small field beside the house. Richard observed with a mixture of pride and admiration how Sophie, without any fear, extended her hand to caress Jack's snout, which lowered gently to allow the contact. On the porch, while serving the meal, Ellie brought news from the school. "Sophie is doing wonderfully well. Her drawings of Sweet River and Jack impressed everyone so much that we decided to organize an exhibition." "She has a natural talent," agreed Richard. "Who knows she might become an artist?" "Speaking of talents," intervened Joseph, "how's that project you mentioned the last time we visited?" Richard smiled, a gleam of enthusiasm in his eyes. "It's taking shape. I talked with some former employees of Anderson Enterprises who lost their jobs when the company closed. We're planning to create a local artisan cooperative. We already have orders for my furniture, for Mrs. Zoe's ceramics, and for Marina's woven rugs." "A brilliant idea," praised Ellie. "Sweet Valley needs more economic opportunities that don't depend on big companies." "It's a modest start," admitted Richard. "Nothing compared to what I had before, but there's something much more gratifying in building something that benefits the whole community, not just myself." Joseph nodded with approval. "That's how you build something lasting, something with real meaning." The conversation flowed naturally during lunch, punctuated by laughter and plans for the future. When they finished, Ellie remembered, "I almost forgot. I brought something for Sophie." From her bag, she took out a book bound in synthetic leather with the title The Legends of Sweet River engraved on the cover. "It's a compilation of local stories we collected at the school. There's an entire chapter about Jack. I thought she would love it." "She certainly will," confirmed Richard, leafing through the book with interest. "She's been increasingly interested in the region's stories." At that moment, an enthusiastic shout from Sophie made them look outside. The girl was pointing to something in the river, her face illuminated with joy. "Look, it's Isabella." Everyone stood up to see what had provoked such excitement. On the opposite bank of Sweet River, a traditional canoe was gliding smoothly, conducted by a middle-aged Native American woman. It was Isabella, a descendant of the valley's first inhabitants, who preserved and shared her people's traditions. "Sophie has been meeting with Isabella almost every day," explained Richard to the visitors. "She has been teaching my daughter about the region's medicinal plants, about the history of her people, about the sacred connection with the river." "An education that no school could provide," commented Ellie admiringly. Joseph smiled, a nostalgic gleam in his eyes. "The river has always been a teacher for those who know how to listen. Jack learned its secrets. Sophie is learning too." The afternoon advanced slowly, filled with conversations, stories, and the silent but comforting presence of the buffalo that peacefully grazed near the house. When the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Joseph announced it was time to depart. "Jack and his family need to return before nightfall," he explained, rising with the help of his cane. Sophie, who had joined them on the porch for a snack, made a small pout of disappointment. "Do they really have to go?" "Unfortunately, yes, little one," replied Joseph, caressing the girl's hair. "But we'll be back soon, and you can always visit us at the farm." "Do you promise to bring Jack again?" "I promise," assured the old man, with an affectionate smile. "I think he likes you as much as you like him." As Joseph and Ellie prepared to leave, Richard observed Sophie saying goodbye to the buffalo. There was a special connection between his daughter and those animals, especially Jack. It was as if they shared a secret, an understanding that transcended words. When the jeep finally drove away, taking the buffalo in the trailer, Richard and Sophie remained on the porch, observing the sunset over Sweet River. The waters, golden in the evening light, flowed serenely, so different from the turbulent current of that fateful day. "Daddy," said Sophie, breaking the contemplative silence, "do you think Mommy would be proud of us now?" The question caught Richard by surprise. Sophie rarely spoke about Anna as if the memory of her mother was something too precious to be mentioned casually. "I'm sure she would, Princess," he replied after a moment, feeling a lump in his throat. "She always knew what was really important in life. I was the one who took time to understand." Sophie nodded, satisfied with the answer. "You know, Daddy, sometimes I feel like she's still here, taking care of us. Like Jack takes care of the river." Richard smiled, moved by the wisdom his 5-year-old daughter demonstrated. Somehow Sophie understood truths that had taken him a lifetime to discover. "I think you're right, Sophie. Some connections are never lost, they just transform." That night, after putting Sophie to bed and reading to her some of the legends from the new book, Richard sat on the porch with a cup of tea, contemplating the stars that were beginning to dot the night sky. Sweet River reflected the silvery light of the crescent moon, creating a luminous path on the waters. He thought about everything he had lost, and everything he had gained in the last few months. The mansion, the luxury cars, the social prestige, all of that had disappeared. But in its place he had found something infinitely more valuable: reconnection with his daughter, a community that had welcomed him despite his mistakes, a purpose that went beyond the accumulation of wealth. And perhaps most importantly, he had found himself, not the Richard Anderson fabricated by ambition and the relentless pursuit of status, but the man Anna had loved, the father Sophie deserved. A familiar sound on the riverbank attracted his attention. There, illuminated by moonlight, was Jack. Alone, without Thunder or Iris, the immense buffalo observed the Andersons' house like a silent guardian. Richard stood, approaching the edge of the porch to better see the animal. "Thank you," he said softly, knowing it was impossible for the buffalo to understand his words, but feeling the need to express them anyway. "For saving my daughter. For saving me." Jack remained motionless for a few moments, his eyes reflecting the moonlight like two dark jewels. Then, with a slow and deliberate movement, he lowered his head in a gesture that almost seemed like a reverence before turning and disappearing into the darkness. Richard went back inside the house, feeling a peace he had never known in his years of business success. He checked on Sophie, who slept peacefully, a slight smile on her angelic face. On the wall of the room, a colorful drawing showed 3 figures: A man, a girl in a wheelchair, and an immense buffalo, all holding hands or hooves under a smiling sun. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the cooperative to establish, the financial restitutions to continue paying, the community service to fulfill. But for the first time in a long time, Richard didn't fear the future. Sweet River would continue flowing, Jack would continue guarding its secrets, and he and Sophie would continue building, day by day, a life that finally made sense. A new dawn had come to Sweet Valley, and with it,